Should I use functions? First of all, functions make a program easier to read and understand. Second, functions reduce code duplications. And third, functions allow the code to be reused. That means once you wrote a function for a particular task, you can use it in different places, not in only in one program, but many other programs in the future. Let me give you a real-life example of what functions are. Imagine that you are managing a company and you hire some employees. Each employee has a defined task to do, and when you need that task to be done, you call upon that person to do it for you. In this analogy, the person who manages the company is the main program, and each employee is a function with a defined task. For example, let's say that you hire a person which is in charge of copying documents. Every time that you need a document to be copied, you call that person, give him or her some piece of paper, and then that person goes and copies the papers and returns the copies to you. In this analogy, you are the main program or the calling program, and that person is a function that you call. The input for the function is the document to be copied, and the output of that function is the copied document. You may also consider that the function may have more than one input. For example, in addition to the documents that you give to the person to be copied, you may also ask the person to make 5 copies. In that case, you are giving 2 inputs to the function. The first input is the documents, and the second input is the number of copies that you require. There may also be some functions that have no inputs. For example, imagine a person who is hired to make coffee and has no other tasks. In this case, there is no need for any input to this person. As soon as you call this person, he or she knows what to do because that's the only task that person has, and goes and makes the coffee, and there is no need for any input. Now let me show you another example. This time I'm going to write the function which calculates a square root of a number, and then I will write a program which will call this function. As usual, I open the IDLE, open a blank text editor, and then save the file under a name which I can call it, and this time I call it my square root function. On the top of the function, I always put some comments so in the future I remember why I wrote this function. And the comment in this case says this function calculates and returns the square root of the number which is given to it as input. I start by using the keyword def, which means I am starting to define my function. I call my function my square root and open parentheses, and since it only accepts one number, I just call it input number. I could have called it anything else that I wanted. And of course, this is followed by a colon, and I go to start writing the body of my function. Again, remember, the body of a function always have to be tab. If you don't remember the program to calculate the square root, please go back to the previous lesson when I showed you how to write a program to calculate the square root. This function is basically the same program, except I'm writing it again as a function this time. I start by guessing the square root number, and that number is half of the input number. Then I specify the accuracy that I want. In this case, let's say I want 0.001 accuracy. Then I put a while loop, and I say if the absolute difference between the square root of my guess and my input number is greater than my accuracy, then I have to adjust my guess. And I apply the equation that we talked about, the square root, which is basically add the square root to the input number divided by square root and divide the whole thing by 2. This while loop will continue until the accuracy is within the tolerance that we want, and in that case we return the square root value. Now I will write my main program, or the actual program which calls the function. Again, I start with a comment line which says this is the main program to check my square root function. So I put a for loop in here. and my for loop goes from 1 to 20. Again, remember the range function. When I use the range function to go from 1 to 20, the last number would be 21, so I can go from 1 to 20. Remember how this for loop runs is that the first time it runs, x will be equal to 1. The next time x would be equal to 2, and so on. So each time I will pass the x as the input to my square root function, and my square root function returns the value of the square root of that number, which I save it into a variable called y, and then I print that the square root of my number is such and such. And when I run this program, you see that it will run 20 times, and each time it calculates the square root.